Hi, and welcome to a special Washington, D.C. episode of InstaVision. I'm here in the palatial new Washington, D.C. PJTV studios and, talking about everything that matters. Speaking of Washington, almost 200 years ago, Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story warned of demagogues, who he said would flatter the people that they may betray them. That's pretty much what Katie Pavlich is talking about in her new book, Assault and Flattery, The Truth About the Left and Their War on Women. She's a Fox News contributor, a news editor at Town Hall, and an expert on politics and gender. Welcome, Katie.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks for coming. So we've heard a lot about a war on women lately, but you say it's the Democrats who are actually waging it. How's that?
You know, the left has this habit of accusing their opponents of exactly what they're actually doing, and the war on women is no exception. You know, I covered the 2012 presidential election very closely. I was on the campaign trail for a couple weeks on end, and I came away from that election with the idea that Democrats wanted women to be dependent on government, not independent from it. And when you take a look at what the left is accusing their opponents of, and you dig into looking, well, maybe let's see what they're actually up to, considering this is their pattern of history and behavior. There are decades and decades of different aspects of the left doing things, passing policies that are bad for women. And then, of course, there's the men in the Democratic Party who have a very severe bad history with women. You know, I like my title, Assault and Flattery, because there are some literal assaults of women, but the flattery part, you know, the definition of flattery is giving people false compliments in order to get a personal gain.
I love in the book you talk about it. I think you were on CNN with Hillary Rosen, and you said something about how Ted Kennedy wasn't such a hero for women since, you know, he left one to drown.
Yeah.
And she acted very offended.
Yeah. Well, this is actually one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is because I was at the 2012 DNC convention, and I was listening to speeches for days and hours, and the big theme of the DNC was the war on women. And not only did they have Bill Clinton speak on the same night as Sandra Fluck, which is ironic in itself, right? But they played a 5-minute tribute video to Ted Kennedy of his life, this amazing politician, and they actually stamped the words "women's rights champion" on the video in large text. And coincidentally, in this glorification of his life, they failed to put in the portion where he left a young, loyal campaign staffer female in his car to die, and she did. She didn't drown. She suffocated to death. But he drove his car off a bridge, left her there to die, and I mentioned that on Piers Morgan's show, and the panel blew up. Hillary Rosen immediately cut me off, so I couldn't, finish really that whole story. Piers Morgan told me it was a below-the-belt comment. And then during the commercial break, Hillary Rosen, who of course is famous for saying that Ann Romney has never worked a day in her life, she turned to me and said that she thought what I said was disgusting, to which I responded, I think what he did was disgusting. They don't want to talk about that history.
One of the things that I've noticed, actually, that people on the left do is they try to turn anything that destroys their narrative into some kind of a breach of manners.
Right.
And I think they do that because they figure that works pretty well in conservatives, because conservatives want to be well-mannered.
Right.
Doesn't work on me. I'm a libertarian. We don't care.
Right.
But I think that's, and it often works. It's somehow, it's gauche to mention the fact that Ted Kennedy, basically to save his political career, he hoped, left a woman to die, and ran off to lawyer up before anything else got done.
Right.
That's like, I don't know, wearing the wrong color tie or something.
Yeah. Well, the left doesn't want you to talk about history because it debunks their narrative. And speaking of history, another reason they don't want you to talk about history is because they've actually hijacked history and rewritten history. So the left doesn't want you to know, and I talk about this extensively in the book, that it was Republicans who fought for women's suffrage. It was Democrats who tried to keep women from voting. It was Republicans who wanted women voting and wanted women more integrated into society. And it wasn't until later, many decades after the women's suffrage movement, that Democrats saw this opportunity for this radical socialist Marxist revolution, and they came in, hijacked the movement, and Democrats have been given credit for being the party of women ever since. The first congresswoman ever elected to Congress was a Republican. But the left wouldn't have you know that because they don't want to talk about the history that's really actually involved in the women's suffrage movement and then how they hijacked it in the 1960s.
Just like they don't want you to know that Bull Connor was a member of the Democratic National Committee,
right? It's very similar to the civil rights movement that
just
way.
last week, we had 2 big media dust-ups over women with guns. Holly Fisher, who goes by Holly Hobby Lobby,
yes.
And teenage huntress Kendall Jones. There was a Kill Kendall Jones page on Facebook they finally took down. Why are liberals so upset about the idea of women with guns?
I think it comes down to their ideology. They believe in government control. When the left says that they are about empowering women, on the gun control issue, they're really not. They're about taking away a woman's right to be equal with men. You know, God made man and God made woman, but Sam Colt made them equal. And the bottom line is that women had a right to own a firearm before they had the right to carry a firearm, or before they had the right to vote. And it's really important for women to have that great equalizer. And yet, this left side of the spectrum that claims to want women's equality takes away a very important tool for women to use to defend themselves against a violent attacker. And that comes down to control. And it's the opposite of what they claim and preach, which is another myth that I debunk in my book. You know, if liberals really are about female empowerment and independence, then why are they constantly pushing legislation that puts women into a more vulnerable, dependent situation, especially when it comes to personal protection and self-defense?
And on the other hand, one place where they make men disappear is in the area of fatherhood. And in fact, you talk about how in the Obama campaign's Life of Julia storyboard, Julia's baby Zachary doesn't have a father. He's just not in the picture at all. We don't know where Zachary came from. Spontaneous generation, maybe. Is part of this because the Democrats deliberately want to adopt policies that put the government in the position of a husband and father?
Yeah, I mean, they have turned victimization into some kind of an empowering message for women. And The Life of Julia in 2012, I thought, was one of the most sexist, dehumanizing things that the Democrats have done to women. You know, they show this woman from cradle to grave, dependent on the government for everything, raising her child, taking a man out of the picture, healthcare, student loans, housing, you name it. But my big question is, why is it that there was not a Life of John? Why is it that Democrats only think that it's women who are weak enough that they need the government to provide everything throughout their whole life? I mean, is that not sexist to not do a Life of John and inequality? I mean, that made no sense to me. And on the issue of this government dependence and taking men out of the home, I have a ton of history in the book about how the women's rights movement in the 1960s was actually based in Marxism and socialist policies. And if you read that material that I found actually at the National Organization for Women Conference, it's all about breaking down the family. And it's all about taking men out of the system because they see the modern or the traditional family as the nuclear thing that keeps the capitalist society together.
It's a rival power center.
Exactly. And so if they can destroy that family structure, they destroy capitalism, and then they get to replace it with the state, which is exactly what they've been doing for the past 50 years and exactly what we saw Barack Obama promoting in 2012 and something they're going to continue to promote in 2014 and 2016.
So I mentioned this to my wife, and my wife said, well, you know, a lot of women want to be dependent on the state. This stuff appeals to them because they like the idea of Uncle Sugar writing them a check. What's the answer to that?
You know, I actually have a different approach to that. I think we have to you know, I get the question a lot, why do young single women vote for the left and vote for Democrats? And I think that the answer is because they haven't been told anything else. They go through a public school system that is very liberal. Then they go to their universities where there is not a trace of the other side of the argument that I'm making in my book. The only argument that they're getting is the argument of it's okay to be dependent on the government. Dependence is empowering. It's okay to get that check through these women's studies groups and through the women's programs on campus. And you can't fault them if they've never heard the other side of the story. You know, you can't fault someone for knowing one thing and then not knowing the other if no one's ever told them. So I'm hoping that with this book, it'll kind of present the other side of the argument for some of those people to finally get you can't blame people for not knowing something if they've never been told it, right? So I think that it's a matter of trying to infiltrate those kind of pockets of, you know, a monopoly on that thought. Democrats have been running that conversation at the university level where a lot of indoctrination for everyone comes down, but especially for young women. And it's important to kind of get in there and say, look, there's two sides to every story. And there are very simple questions that can be asked. And you ask any young woman, do you want to be an independent woman? She's going to say yes, right? And your follow-up question to that is, well, then why would you want to be dependent on a government that's mostly run by men? And so that is something that, you know, you have to ask basic questions, but the bottom line is they've never been asked those questions before. They've only been told one side of the story. So you have to tell the other side for people to understand where their options are.
You know, the media narrative is also a problem. And, you know, it's interesting. Would a Republican male get the pass that Hillary Clinton has gotten for attacking a rape victim as she defended his accuser?
Absolutely not. No. You know, and Hillary Clinton, in my mind, and I make this argument as well, will go down as in history with a legacy as one of the most notorious defenders of America's most powerful and worst sexual abusers. And I'm not just talking about Bill Clinton. I'm talking about the child rapist. It's not the issue that she defended him. It's the issue that she laughed about getting him off. And if you actually look at the court documents, it shows that she, the evidence problem wasn't enough for her. She had to attack a 12-year-old girl as being emotionally unstable and having romanticized sexual fantasies about older men. I mean, it wasn't enough for her just to deal with the facts of the case.
That's all the stuff that the evil male lawyer does in the movies made for Hallmark or Lifetime, right?
Right, exactly.
Right.
And then you fast forward through Hillary Clinton's life, and of course she put up with Bill Clinton's philandering, and it wasn't just about that. It was about she actually helped destroy the women who Bill Clinton was using and flattering, and then threw to the side and ruin their lives. I mean, Monica Lewinsky is a good example of a person who has said that she hasn't had a lot of opportunities as a result of the way that all happened. And then you fast forward even more to Hillary Clinton's time in the State Department, where there was rampant sexual abuse of women and girls right under her nose, and she chose to ignore it. And when female whistleblowers came forward, she had her chief of staff shut them down. And so when Hillary Clinton claims to be this big proponent of women and girls and women's rights around the world, her history at the State Department and throughout the rest of her life tells a very different story.
So, exit question. It's obvious that the Democrats plan to ramp up the war on women theme for Hillary's campaign. Do you think they're going to overreach?
I don't necessarily know if they're going to overreach. I think it's important for Republicans to respond. So I interviewed Mitt Romney in my book about the whole binders full of women controversy. And I think the biggest problem with Republicans losing this argument is that they just refuse to address the issue. So when they're talking about a contraception ban, it's up to Republicans to come back and say that they're lying, because they are lying. I mean, you look at the claims that were made in 2012, the claims that are being made now in light of the Hobby Lobby decision, they're straight up lies in order to scare women into voting a certain way based on false promises and bogus claims by these so-called women's groups. And one other thing that I want to address real quickly, I've been hearing a lot about the Hobby Lobby case, and we're hearing now from these women's groups saying there were 5 men on the Supreme Court who decided they're going to overreach into women's health care. I always find it so interesting that these women's rights groups fail to acknowledge the females that are in a certain scenario. The president of now, Terry O'Neill, went on MSNBC to talk about how 50% of the population is female and how they're not going to take it anymore. But she failed to mention that the entire legal team for Hobby Lobby was made up of women. No one's talking about that. Yeah, the from the Beckett Fund, all women.
Also, wasn't it all males who decided Roe against Wade?
Exactly, and that too, and that's a whole other argument. But my point is that they pick and choose which women they want to actually listen to, and instead of seeing these women and having this amazing victory at the Supreme Court, the highest level of legal work that you can do, and that will go down in history, they're just choosing to ignore them and focusing on the Supreme Court justices who happen to be male, and I find that very appalling as well.
Well, if you're a woman who doesn't support their power structure, you're not a real woman at all, which I guess means
Right.
you're not a real woman to
I
them.
just I don't count, everyone. Sorry.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And it's Katie Pavlich. The book is Assault and Flattery: The Truth About the Left and Their War on Women. Don't miss it. And thanks for tuning in to this episode of InstaVision. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, have fun on the internet. Thanks.